This is Scenic Roots Talking Writing. Our guest is Dr. Jing Tsu. Dr. Tsu, a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow, is a literary scholar and cultural historian of modern China at Yale University. Her most recent book, Kingdom of Characters, traces China's evolution through the 20th century and into the 21st century by telling the story of how its very language was transformed. At the turn of the 20th century, the formal Chinese language, on paper, was a series of characters that were incomprehensible to almost the entire population. More than 90% of the 1.3 billion people in China couldn't read the characters that numbered into the thousands. Those who learned to read the characters spent their entire lives learning to decipher all of the characters in the written Chinese language. This is Dr. Tsu reading from the introduction to the book, Kingdom of Characters.
16th century Jesuit missionaries labored to learn it. 17th century savants were fascinated by it, and 18th century sinologists fetishized it. How an entire civilization outside of Christendom evolved to have a writing system as complex and massive as the Chinese script has been an enduring linguistic mystery for outsiders. This inquiry poorly masks a deep suspicion. How can a people who read and write in characters ever think the way we do? Even in the late 20th century, views like this were touted by Western experts in different fields. Alphabetic thinking, social theorists would say, explains the advent of the scientific revolution in the West. A modern theorist of networks and the digital age sees the alphabet as a conceptual technology that forms the bedrock of Western science and technology. A scholar of ancient Greece saw the signs much earlier at the fount of Western civilization, where the alphabetic mind was responsible for all the West's accomplishments. Joseph Needham, a renowned British historian of Chinese science, spent his life's work defending scientific inventions in ancient China against claims like these. But he also recognized that the Chinese language remained the greatest barrier for Westerners to understanding the minds of the Chinese. It is China's first and last Great Wall. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842 marked the beginning of a new course for China. During a series of crises and confrontations with the Western world that would keep China in an inferior position well into the early years of the 21st century, the demise of the Chinese script was foretold by many. Still, the Chinese were hesitant to accept the prospect of a future without their written language. They saw how the Chinese language, like the empire, might not be viable in a modern world increasingly transformed by various branches of Western science and new modes of electricity-powered communication, beginning with the telegraph. But the Chinese language had been the fundamental building block of China's cultural universe. So rooted was the script in the country's history and institutions over the millennia that it was difficult for the Chinese to consider abandoning it. From the grassroots to the highest level of the modern state, intellectuals, teachers, engineers, everyday citizens, eccentric inventors, duty-bound librarians, and language reformers embarked on one of the most extraordinary revolutions of the millennium in search of a solution. That is the subject of this book. The rude awakening of Western cannons firing at the gates, a teetering empire and the last throes of the imperialistic order, an urgency to modernize taken into overdrive by a new political ethos. All these shifts compel the Chinese to embark on a parallel course, to get their language on the same footing as languages using the Western alphabet. Bridging the chasm between two radically different scripts and systems of language seemed impossible at times, and the onus was mostly on the Chinese to modernize, or what amounted to the same thing for most of the 20th century, to Westernize. The scale of the transformation was daunting. This important process lies at the core of China's modern identity. But the burden of this assimilation may be hard to imagine for those who have not experienced it.
What I know about China would fit comfortably on one of my fingernails. And so from the beginning, everything you were telling me was new information. And, Yoko Ono famously said that our brains are like Velcro, that once you know something, other things will stick to it. But if you don't have that foundation, then you're creating Velcro effectively, which is what I was doing, reading your book and trying to understand. And it helped when you wrote, and you're not the first person I've heard say something like this, to think in English, I had to breathe and live a worldview that was expressed and constructed in that language. That's beautifully expressed. And you were born in Taiwan.
Yes, that is correct. My parents from mainland, but I was born in Taiwan, and then we moved to the States when I was about 9. So
Right.
it's still a pretty malleable age.
Yes, but you had already learned to speak and think in a language.
Correct.
Which wasn't
so,
English.
Chinese, which, right, it didn't help me much with English, I'm afraid.
Not at all. And so in that sense, it seems to me that your book is in some sense a kind of mirror of your own experience.
It is, and actually thank you for picking that up. And I actually did not put in that personal bit until the very end, because I realized that it was a lot to ask my readers who might not know Chinese to enter this world with me, and that they might find it daunting. But then, of course, I went through the same experience with English. So I thought if I could extend that invitation and meet them halfway at the beginning, that maybe they'd be more willing to come on this journey with me. So I'm certainly glad you read the book.
Your book traces more than 100 years of the evolution, if you will. I'm not sure that necessarily Chinese people see it this way, but the evolution of the Chinese language so that it became comprehensible, at least widely comprehensible. It seems to me, interestingly, not just to international readers like me, in as much as by the process of what you called Romanization, of taking this incredible mode of script. I'm tempted to call the script a pictograph, but that's not necessarily accurate, is it? Some of them are pictographs, right? Some of the characters?
There's certainly a small, yes, about 3%, but no more than that are actually what we properly think of as pictographic. That is to say, they depict objects. Otherwise, they're actually kind of abstract, not as abstract as the alphabet. But, it's actually good to remember that even the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, which is at the fount of the Western alphabet we know now, was also ideographic in its origin. But I think you're right. If we dial back like 100, turn the 20th century, more than 100 years ago, where the Chinese script, where it was at, we're talking about a world, a country, massive country, a huge swath of land where there were like hundreds of different dialects. Like a person from the north might not necessarily understand someone from the south. And also written language was reserved for the few, right? Not that many people were literate. And if you were literate, you were aristocratic or gentry. It was a very small percentage of the country. And so with the pressure of modernization and the fall of the empire and the onslaught of Western science and technology and military prowess, the Chinese really had to think about, to give power to the people, right? To build a nation, we need the people. And to give power to the people, we need to give them the power of language.
And as, has been expressed from, I guess, Mary, Queen of Scots on in the Western world, it's always a bit dangerous to give the average person the ability to understand these things, to read them. Her argument was, back in the, 16th century, the Bible should remain in Latin because the average person wouldn't understand it even though they could read it. it seems as if 4 centuries later, at the beginning of the 20th century, China was in essentially the same situation. It's also struck me as interesting, and something that perhaps is telling, is when you said
it really is.
China is the same size as America. I never thought about it like that. It always seemed like so much bigger.
I know, it's odd. It seems so much bigger, but it's also true that, that's how the Western missionaries were trying to explain, right, China to America, that they were kind of like mirror images of one another. But of course, it's also a very fundamental difference, which is, geographically, China borders 14 countries, right? I mean, current day China, and 14 on land and another 6 by sea. And whereas United States always been blessed with these 2 bodies of water and really just one neighbor to the north and then another one to the south. So for Chinese, to achieve a kind of linguistic unity amidst all these different languages, because the West is basically Turkic, right, Central Asia, to achieve the kind of linguistic unity that was able to was really no small feat, because you both had to unite and standardize a language within as the national standard, and then try to figure out how to then connect that to the global technological infrastructure for communication, which was largely created in the image of the alphabet.
Yes, by Americans who
precisely
used the Roman alphabet.
Yes.
Okay,
I wasn't going to make that distinction, given you're British, but yes.
Okay, so
we all knew that the Morse code is really American English too.
Yes, that's right. So, but to back up a second, okay. So, and what you just said adds more information to the puzzle. But I think it's first important to note that, despite the fact that in terms of the landmass, America and China are essentially the same, China has 4 times the population of the US, which seems to me, aside from anything else, to speak to the incredible density of the population.
Well, and here's I think this really puts into perspective in terms of how we think of China now. China has by now created a middle class that is more than twice the population of the United States. So imagine that. And this middle class, if we dial back again to the early 20th century for this whole series of language innovation, breakthroughs, and technological barriers that I describe in the book, if you dial back to the early 20th century, this is the germination of that middle class, right? To give them education, to give them literacy, because that's what language is about. And you mentioned earlier how the Bible was written, make sure that it was really in language, Latin, that's reserved for the few. Well, the same argument has been made for, education for women and children, right? You dispossess people of the ability to gain education, right? And that is what makes them controllable, right? That's how you keep them down. And that was sort of big realization early 20th century in China, was that you have to give the people power, because the old way of doing things, concentrating elite and power and access in the hands of the few, that was the old way. That's the days of the empire, but not for the coming nation.
The notion of universal literacy in the Western world, my understanding is that was essentially a 20th century phenomenon. That was when most people in the Western world began to read what was written in their native language, whether it be English or French or Spanish or whatever. So that's that's, as you said, the foundation of democratization.
Yeah.
So it took 40 more years, almost 50 years. I guess if you were to... my understanding is that for most people, the ability to read the language they spoke in China didn't really happen until almost the 1960s.
Yeah, and literacy was very difficult. And I talk about the literacy rate and the founding of New China. And, the literacy then was still quite low, up to, 90-some percentile now. So if you go from like an agrarian society, right, a century ago, with a large population that was illiterate, to now, and while keeping that very cumbersome language system, right, very complex, hard-to-learn language system in place, while making this huge spike in literacy happened. I mean, that took extraordinarily. You had to think about what did the Chinese have to do to their language to make that happen, to both preserve it as something that's core to their cultural heritage, and also somehow to modernize it. So a lot of this really kind of took place behind the scenes in a technological, structural aspect of how you think about Chinese characters, how you mobilize them, how you break them down to fit the alphabetic structure, how you encode them for computing input, so on and so forth.
To go back to a sort of fundamental, first of all, we in the West take it for granted that when you write from left to right and you write on a lined sheet. But Chinese script was conceived in boxes, and the boxes run right to left and from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. So it goes from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, then back to the top again, running from right to left. Yeah. And each one of those, each one of those characters is a composite of a number of individual strokes. And as you said, there are people who spent their whole lives learning how to read these things.
That's right. So the trick of the 20th century is, how do you make that learning process easier? Yeah. You think about how we use Chinese now, right? I mean, it's actually incredible. I mean, you kind of, you see, if you go out into a room with Chinese smartphone users and they're all typing into their phones, it's not the same as you and I typing, composing a text message, because for the Chinese, there are a dozen or more different input methods that they could use. So they could input Chinese as, Romanized spelling, right, which is the most common one, or they can improvise about any other method that uses parts of characters, that uses predictive texting, and all this kind of technology that could not have happened without computerizing Chinese in the first place. And that didn't really happen until the 70s. But before that, the lead up to that was long. It took rethinking Chinese in terms of how to break it down into parts so that it could somehow resemble having these units like 26 letters of the alphabet. But things for a very long time, Chinese characters were not seen that way, right? Each character was a whole character. You didn't break it up. You observed the radical, which is one part of characters that, characters might have in common as a way of classifying them and putting them into groups and organizing them. But you really didn't think of Chinese characters modular, like Lego, like units that you can kind of move around and, put together, reassemble, break down. And that's indeed what happened to the Chinese script. So essentially the big breakthrough in the book is really when the Chinese began to think of the Chinese writing system, figured out how to use it as though it were made of letters of the alphabet, but without using any alphabet letters.
I know. I thought that was an incredible insight on, and you'll have to forgive me, Jing. I can't pronounce most of these names, so I'm not going to attempt it. But the man who broke the characters into a composite of strokes. And then... Yes,
is this a typewriter? Is this a typewriter guy we're talking about?
So then he was able to make a typewriter. Yeah. Before that, before they ever could think about a typewriter, the first thing they had to come to terms with was the telegraph. And how do you send a character over the telegraph? It's not possible.
Right, and actually that story is about an early fateful decision that was made that then the Chinese tried to reverse. So the story there was, in the 19th century, the big telegraphic magnates were basically the Danes and the British. And the Danes got to China first, mainly by not taking no for an answer from the Chinese, and they basically laid a telegraphic cable on Chinese territory one night regardless. So that's how they got in there. But the second thing they did was they came up with a telegraphic code book for Chinese characters because they realized, okay, this is going to make, if the Chinese can use this, maybe they'll be more open. They'll be less hostile to, our technology and our business, basically. And so they employed a French harbor master that was in Shanghai to come up with a code book. But what he did was he did something random. So it's obvious that you can't send characters in alphabet letters. So he decided that, well, maybe you can code them by numbers, and you send them as strings of 4 digits. So he did this, and it works, but the problem was it was very hard to use. He didn't have a systematic logic for how the characters were organized or how they were numbered. So basically, if you're a telegraphic operator, if you were to send a telegram in Chinese, you have to go to a code book. You have to look up the numbers. You have to find the character and then put that into a tab of, short and long dashes or dots. And that was very laborious. There was a lot of mistakes in the process. And so, the Chinese had to figure out, look, you can't do that to us because the system doesn't work well. And more to the point, it doesn't make sense. There's no real organizational logic. This guy just took 4 numbers and just sort of slapped it onto a character. And so the problem was, and this became a graver issue, was that the Chinese ended up also having to pay more for sending telegrams. Why? Because Morse code numbers were more expensive than letters. So if you had to send a Chinese telegram, 4 letters per character, that really added up.
As is probably becoming apparent to anybody listening, this is an incredibly complicated story. In some respects, as you've just noted, it comes down to China was being forced into the modern world by people from the outside who didn't even begin to understand the country and just wanted to exploit it. And it wasn't really until the Cultural Revolution led by Mao in the 40s that somebody leading the country recognized that if the country was going to even begin to exploit its incredible potential, both nationally and internationally, they first had to create a language that everybody could read and understand, and then bring everybody on board with it. And it seems to me that until that revolution, there were basically 2 streams of people in the country. There were those who wanted to modernize, but the great majority of people who held power had no interest in modernizing. They wanted to, and understandably, given the incredible history of the country and in Western terms, it's almost unimaginable how long the history of China and Chinese culture is.
It is true that this is a complex story. That's why it was so important for me to tell this story through these human characters, right, who we can rely on, connect to, and, see the history, see big history through their individual eyes. So in some ways, it was not so difficult as you saw how each of them, did it brick by brick, right? They put their minds together like tinkerers and inventors. There were also hacks and adventurers and geniuses along the way. Basically, everyone had a stake, Westerners and Westerners and Chinese alike, to modernize Chinese. For the Westerners, like the Danes, it was to break into the Chinese market. For the Chinese, it was about internationalizing, integrating with the world. So I think the story told through these individual, human characters were really key to help us navigate and in some ways easily sail through this landscape of technological innovations and details and wars and revolution. Because this book is also, I wrote it for 3 reasons. I wanted to write a book that tells the story of how China became the global power that it is today. And I also wanted to show how the driving force behind this was the modernization of its language, what I think of as China's first and last Great Wall. And finally, I want to make this a human story too, because it's not just the states and governments and policymakers that made this possible. It was the individual innovators, right, who gave up, family, life, some, their wealth and fame, just to devote themselves to being part of this great revolution. That was the longest revolution of the 20th century.
It's almost incomprehensible to us in the West to come to terms with what exactly happened in China. Effectively, it was a country with an enormous, long history, and people, bit by bit, had to make the case that despite this incredible history and this incredibly deep culture, everything's going to have to start again. Because as long as China was independent of the West, they were victims of the West. Westerners would come in, and as you said, they do it stealthily, often literally in the dark. They'd put down telegraph lines, as an example, without telling anybody. They wanted to do it, and so they did it. Chairman Mao, I think, perhaps what's so astonishing about that revolution is, okay, there's more than 1 billion people. There are, as you said, innumerable languages, people communicating in different ways, and yet this man, almost by himself, sort of wrested a state of order and made the country both what it was, but at the same time palatable to the West, so that China could reach the point it has now, which is almost the obverse of where it was at the beginning of the 20th century, where they were hugely in debt and were at the point of collapse. Now the rest of the world is in debt to China.
Well, and in some ways it's reversed, but I think it also highlights something that we don't see when we look at China now. You're not going to see another country, right? It would be hard to name another country that has worked as hard and done as much to integrate with the outside world. And oddly now, you also will be hard to find another country that feels itself more misunderstood by the world that is trying to integrate. And what I really try to do in this book, and I'm so glad you asked because that's really the big message, I wanted to write a book that shows how, China and the West had long been learning from one another before they turned foes. And I say that, with an eye and to the present and where we are now, after 2 centuries of coming to terms with one another. And I really hope people can take that message with them, right? That in some ways, China did a lot to make itself where it is today. And it was hard won. And you also now find and learn the most from the United States, from the West. So there's a lot to take forward into the future as we think about how China will continue to evolve in this world.
So your comment about China building the country's cultural soft power struck me as an echo of what the United States did in the 20th century. Cultural soft power, if you will, from Hollywood and also from the music. It created an image in people's minds of the country and the culture universally across the world. And the impression I have from your book is that China intends to do the same thing in the 21st century, to make itself comprehensible to, as you say, a universal population who, for the most part, I don't think have a very clear idea at all of the country, not even of its landmass, let alone its culture.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think that is a story that has not been fully written yet, right? We still don't know what China's what it's going to project as its cultural power. We talk, there's no Levi's jeans, right? There's no jeans. There's no, Coca-Cola. What will China eventually say to the world, right? Right now, I feel like we don't know what that message is going to be yet. And we also are kind of, we have mixed feelings about receiving that message. And so that's why I say that in some way this book leaves us exactly where we should be in thinking about the future.
Yes. In some respects, it seems to me that the history that you've traced in changing the form of the language is ultimately realized with the computer. And as you noted, there are 900 million internet users in China. What impact that's going to have on the rest of the world in the 21st century, I have no idea either. But clearly, it's going to have an impact.
Yes, I believe so too. Yeah. And let's hope that we can write that story together between China and the West, rather than writing our own stories and then continuing to exist in a state of tension as opposed to a renewal of cooperation and optimism, I hope.
Yes, I'm with you. And if we, embrace the idea of the internet as a kind of cultural emissary to every country from every country, it has flattened and reduced this. Somebody keeps, using a hammer rather noisily. I hope you can't hear that. You know, people have famously have said many times that the internet has leveled the playing field. But if you look at it in terms of international relations, I think it's also put us all in the same room, as it were.
I think that's actually true. I think it's a new leveled playing field, which is not to say new advantages won't be created. And the way we arrived at it is also quite unevenly. So I think it's a new level playing field, but it's not once and for all. And I think it will create its own inequities for future generations to resolve.
Yeah, but I think for the longest time, you know, on maps of the world, they would put something like terra incognita. In other words, they didn't know what it was. They knew there was a landmass there, but they didn't know much about it. In the 20th century, it seems to me that in many respects, really, China was the ultimate terra incognita to people in other parts of the world. And the internet...
I agree with you.
The internet kind of turns the light on. You know, the room is dark. It turns the light on.
It does. But I think also it also risks giving us the illusion of seeing everything. Right? We know that we live in a world where it's saturated with information, more information than we can ever sort out. So the question is what that actually does. We also have fake news, right? We also have information that mislead us, and also that we become more entrenched in our own cultural universe. We feel that there's enough in our world to keep us busy, and therefore we're less interested in really learning about each other.
But it's also interesting, it seems to me, that in a book that is, as much as anything, about language and how we communicate, the internet has created a kind of world language.
It does in a way. Well, do you mean a different language from human language, or do you mean a new version, as in truncated communication?
Yeah, it's a way for us to, you know, I understand that, you know, people who are using the internet in China are not reading in English, but at the same time, so much of what's on the internet isn't verbal anyway. It's pictorial.
That's right, emojicons. It's true. We're actually we're trying to recreate a kind of, but I would say an illusion of face-to-face communication. Right, through the use of pictographic emojis, which really is kind of like it is the true pictographic language, right? So, you know, in some ways it's not Chinese, it's really the emojis. But at the same time, there's a very limited repertoire of emojis. How many of them are ambiguous? And also, why do emojis become a kind of language? It's really when the internet was trying to break into the Japanese market, right? And the Japanese were using emojis, so it kind of forced Unicode, which is one of the topic I focused on in the last chapter of the book, had to begin to accept emojis as though it were a human language script. So I think you're right. There's different ways in which communication continues to evolve. But I think regardless of the medium, right, whether you do it digitally, whether you do it through telegraphy or a typewriter, I think at heart the desire is the same, is to communicate, is to influence, is to negotiate. And that, I think, is at the heart of what it really means for China's global power, right? It is not said and done once and for all. It still has miles to go to, I think, persuade the rest of the world to accept it as a dominant power.
But you see, do you see China as the USA of the 21st century?
Well, here I will go back to my telegraphy guy in Chapter 3, Wang Jingchun. Now, this is really about a century ago, where he said China would be the new United States. Do you remember that? But he said that in the vein of, you know, China wants to do business with the United States. We want to be more like you. We can do business. We're not this old, crusted civilization, but we're capable of regeneration and renewal. And I think that is the question of, and I think that's what makes us, in some ways, makes the United States nervous right now, is that we're talking about really a competition between systems, right? A civilization that's utterly different from the West, with different language, different customs. And I think that is something that that is something that unfolds in front of our eyes as we speak. It'll be very interesting and exciting, and I think critical for our century to witness.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to go back to Mao and the revolution, that's something that's almost unimaginable in this country. In fact, the huge divisions that we have in the country at the moment are at least in part resistance to the notion that we should think as a collective. That's antithetical.
Yeah.
That's antithetical to American thinking. But China, if China, led by Mao, had not thought as a collective, they wouldn't be any further forward. But in 70 years, maybe a little less than that, the country's completely reinvented itself and gone from what appeared to be an antiquated and a highly challenged culture in the modern world. It's now gone to become a leader of the modern world. But the interesting thing to me is the interface, as you said, between these two totally different cultures. Are we going to be able to find some kind of rapprochement?
Or do we have to? Or can we each play to our strengths?
If we're going to move forward, we do, don't we? Isn't that one of the theses in your book?
Depends on if we can. Well, but I think it depends on whether we can work in complementary, competitive ways, or whether it has to be a zero-sum game. And that's why I don't embrace these trap thesis where, a war between great powers is inevitable. I think the picture is much more complex than that. It also has to do with the fact that, in fact, even we're looking at a moment of great tension between China and the West. China and the West have never been closer together in terms of, their economy, what they've learned about each other, and then looking at the language itself, right? That's really at this point where they've never been more like each other, where maybe that's why they need to differentiate.
I take your point. There's always the Russians to take into account, but
yes, that too. The world is a complex and treacherous place.
And I'm with you that the notion of a zero-sum game is absurd. It just occurs to me that it's been posited that one of the impacts of the internet is that it's no longer necessary to be physically powerful to be powerful. In that sense, the internet favors females and female energy. And in my mind, female energy is the antithesis of zero sum. Female energy says, how do we cooperate here? How do we mesh with each other and further each other's aims, not competing with each other, but working together?
I certainly hope you're right, Richard, because I think we do need a different way of going about things, don't you?
It would be cool, wouldn't it? That's the promise of the internet, isn't it?
Well, with the new Chinese New Year coming up, at least we can make that into our New Year resolution.
Thank you so much for taking the time with me. I realize, I'm such a neophyte in talking about something that is so close to you. But I have to tell you, Jing, it's been an incredibly eye-opening experience to read your book and to talk to you.
Thank you so much for that. I so deeply appreciate that. And you've asked all the right questions, even if you think yourself as a neophyte. So it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for spending so much time with me today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. I hope perhaps our paths cross again at some time in the future.
Absolutely. Let me know if you come through New York or New Haven.
I'll do it. Thank you so much.
All right. Take good care.
You too. Good day. The book by Dr. Jing Tsu, Kingdom of Characters, helps the novice to Chinese, as a reviewer for the New York Times wrote, understand the underlying challenges the Chinese government faced in converting the written language from thousands of individual characters to one using the 26 letters of the Roman alphabet, and how they conquered those challenges. This is Talking Writing on listener-supported public radio in Chattanooga.